For more on the Brussels terror attacks, I'm joined now by Daveed Garenstein-Ross, a security expert. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. That's a Washington-based think tank. Let me ask you about this. First, this complaint about the sharing of information, Turkey tipping them off. And yet, this is a story we've heard before. I mean, after the Boston bombings, Russia had delivered information about Tsarnaev.
Yes.
And 9/11, we also heard that FBI agents were talking about Moussaoui and trying to tip them off, and no one took their fears seriously. Is it just that there's so much information out there, it's trying to sift through all of this stuff? What's the deal here?
It's not just that. I would compare this more to 9/11 than I would to the Tsarnaevs. For the Tsarnaevs, there were some reasons bureaucratically that they couldn't investigate further, but also the specificity of the tip wasn't great. They simply said that they suspected him of being part of Islamic militancy. Whereas for this tip that came from Turkey, it was that he'd been specifically picked up in Gaziantep, which has a very specific meaning to investigators who are following the Islamic State. Gaziantep is a major entry point for foreign fighters who are going into Syria. In other words, when Turkey passed this information along, it wasn't just that he had been detained. It was that he had been detained in an area which strongly suggested that he was a foreign fighter and bound for Syria.
So what happened? I mean, is it just that it fell through the cracks? I mean, how do you see this?
I don't think we know the answer yet. And what we really need to do is look at the reasons why this wasn't pursued. I'm very hesitant to, and I've resisted pointing to an intelligence failure in the sense that the security services should have done something that they didn't. In the case of the tip about the Tsarnaev brother, that was something where, due to civil liberties concerns, it was difficult for the FBI to run it down. In the case of 9/11, you specifically had bureaucratic problems, lack of information sharing, stovepiping, and the 9/11 Commission report discusses that. My guess is that in this case, there were specific bureaucratic reasons that stopped them from quickly investigating it. We don't know the answer, but that's something which I think needs to be looked into, because we have this old creaky apparatus that a lot of states operate under that's meant for the 20th century, but with the magnitude of threat, how fast it's moving, the ability of these groups to adapt and thwart investigators, we can't afford to have a 20th century creaky, bureaucratic, nonsensical apparatus.
They're nimble, and in other words, the security apparatus should be nimble as well and quick at moving. Let's talk a little bit about Jim's piece, the money. It's just enormous. Is defeating ISIL, you know, we hear the degrading and defeating.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily bombing. Is it going after the money? Is it trying to stop them in Iraq and Syria? Is it trying to stop them in Europe? Is it all of these things?
Well, it's all of these things, but the bombing is also going after the money, to be very clear. Now, ISIL, I think it's accurate to point to how rich they have been. Right now, evidence points to the fact that they are in trouble economically. They had to slash the salaries of their fighters by 50% across the board. If you look at what's happened, the U.S.-led coalition has been very slow to go after oil targets, right? They initially bombed refineries, but they weren't bombing the various convoys that were taking the oil out to the black market. The U.S. has started bombing those convoys. It started bombing basically cash centers where the Islamic State keeps its money. According to U.S. estimates, they've destroyed at least $500 million that way, which is a significant amount. The Iraqi government used to pay the salaries of their bureaucrats who were still in Islamic State-held territory. They cut off that money. And they're losing territory, which means they're losing their ability to tax. I'm not saying this to put a shiny spin on anything, but if you look at what's happening to the Islamic State, the territory that they have to administer, this is actually, it's been transformed, in my estimation, from a strength to a weakness. Now, that doesn't mean that their European network is suffering, because they trained up a whole cadre, according to the Associated Press, 400 people to attack Europe and also to attack other countries. And those people are already ready to go. But in the future, that degrading of the state is in fact going on, and that's a positive thing.
And those setbacks financially and on the battlefield, does that spark more of an interest for them to do what they're doing in Europe now, to get the headlines again?
Absolutely. I think that it'll look a little bit like a sine wave, in my view, where right now, as they're losing territory, and we can see they're being squeezed from both sides right now, with a major offensive to retake Mosul and another one to retake Tadmur, which is also sometimes known as Palmyra. But as they're being squeezed, they're going to invest more in external operations, that is, terrorist attacks abroad, in order to continue to portray their image of strength, which is so important to them. So I think in the short term, the terrorist risk will rise. But in the longer term, as they lose ground, it will recede for a variety of reasons, including that this will deal a blow to their propaganda.
Let me ask you about the freedom of movement in Europe, because people were starting to talk about that as well. Do you see that as a significant issue, the fact that somebody can go into Paris, back to Belgium, moving around pretty freely?
Yeah, it's an issue with respect to intelligence sharing and differing skill levels of national authorities. And look, it's been an open secret in Europe that some countries allow criminals, Islamic radicals, others, groups like the PKK, militant groups, to operate openly in exchange for making sure that they're not going to attack that country or surrounding countries. That was what Londonistan was, right? Pre 9/11, London was a real hub for Islamic radicals. And so that's another problem with respect to the free movement throughout Europe, that there's varying degrees of enforcement from one country to another.
Yeah, it's pretty rich, isn't it? Thanks so much for coming in. Appreciate it.